Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the first long prep topic for grade 12 for 2024. That topic is that we should provide people with disabilities with a direct stipend rather than government disability services. Always in these sessions, we're going to go over a few things. We're going to start off by looking at the context behind the debate, asking the question, why is this debate taking place? And looking at what things might be useful to research before the debate starts. Then you might want to look at setup. That is when we look into the models that both teams might provide, definitions, how each team is going to set up the debate before they get into their arguments. And then we're going to go into a few tips about brainstorming points, although this is probably done better with your team separately. So, to start off with, the context behind the debate and what to research beforehand. The first thing that you should always think of in a debate is to ask yourself the question of why is this debate taking place? And to help you understand that, I have a few possible questions you might want to look at. The first may sound quite simple, but I think it's actually incredibly important in this debate. The first thing that you should look at is you should look at what is a disability and what are the many types of disabilities that people have. As people with disabilities are a very marginalized group within society, it's incredibly important that you talk about that kind of issue quite sensitively. You do not want to spend the entire debate talking about all people with disabilities as if they all experience it in incredibly similar ways, or possibly even the same ways. It's very useful to be able to segment what are the different types of disabilities that people have. How severely do different ones affect people, and in what ways do they affect people? And for some examples of how to segment it, there are probably very different ways that people with very physical disabilities are affected by their disability than people with intellectual disabilities are affected by them. At the same time, someone who, for example, has an amputated entire leg is probably affected quite differently by that than someone who has a disability such as arthritis, which is going to reduce the usefulness of their leg, but possibly not as severely. All of these are very different types of disabilities, and it's important that you do some research into what the very broad concept of a disability is, and also more specifically at different types, so that you are capable of speaking about it sensitively in the debate, and so that you do not homogenize the group. You can talk about them as if there are different ways that they are going to be affected by this. The second thing to look at is what existing government services there are to help people with disabilities. Now, the major one in Australia is called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And for the rest of this slideshow, I'm just going to call it the NDIS, because that's what it's commonly referred to. It's probably what people will refer to it in the debate as after probably the first speaker's introductions. So this is quite, however, a complicated scheme, and it's something that is more complex than I can just explain to you at the start of this video. It's something that I would strongly recommend doing quite a bit of research into, because this debate is probably taking place due to some people's skepticism about whether the NDIS is a very effective scheme at helping people with disabilities. That is probably going to be what most of this debate is somewhat about. It is, however, also useful to look at what other government schemes exist to help people with disabilities, so that you can have some idea about whether they are effective or whether they are not. It might also be useful to look at different countries. Do different countries have very different schemes to the ones that exist in Australia? Does this mean that perhaps if you are the negative team, if you can find other countries that you think have very effective models of government support that are quite different from Australia, you could propose that instead of abolishing government assistance, you should change it quite dramatically, but still make it a government service rather than a direct stipend. And the final thing to look at is, what would a direct stipend be? Now, this, in simple terms, is just giving money directly to individuals. And the difference here is whether or not you give the money directly to the individuals, or whether the government pools that same amount of money together and funds some kind of service. That's the other sort of big part of this debate. It's about working out how much would this direct stipend be? Would there be any conditions that the stipend was reliant on? Does everyone get it? No questions asked. Are there some other ways that you want to judge how much different people get in regards to this with different types of disabilities, perhaps if there are different amounts to which like their job prospects are inhibited or something like that. So you want to look at what a direct stipend would be, sort of vaguely how much it is likely to be, although we'll get to this in models. Numbers are dangerous in debate, so you might not want to have a specific number, but you still want to think about the context of how much it would probably be. The next thing to do is to start to define the topic. And in this topic, there aren't a huge number of things to define that really go in a definition. Disabilities is something that is worth defining in your definition, but it's also worth having within your sort of broader characterization of the debate. So you want to define what people with disabilities means, but then you also want to remember to talk about as many different groups as possible. And we'll get to this in point creation, but that's going to be also a very compelling way to have more and better arguments. The second thing to look at is what a direct stipend is, and the third thing is what a government disability service is. Whilst these are keywords in the topic, they are not really things that are defined as much as modeled by the two teams. A direct stipend has to be the affirmative team model. Government disability services has to be the negative team counter model. You can define what those things mean, but the affirmative team cannot define specifically what the government disability service is, what service it will provide, things like that, because that is the role of the negative team to counter model. Similarly, defining the direct stipend could just make it a bit silly if you then immediately explain it all over again in your model. So it's useful to know that you need to define these, but you might actually find it easier to define them in your model. And that being said, let's get into the models and the counter models. This topic basically gives you the models, but you do still have quite a bit of choice. So obviously, the affirmative team has to support a direct stipend. There is no way around that. You cannot say direct stipend and a bit of government disability service, because if you do that, then the negative team will say government disability service and a bit of stipend. And at that point, both teams support exactly the same thing. And the debate just doesn't have any point of difference to argue. So you have to support a direct stipend and not government disability services in order for teams to actually be able to have a debate. But there is still some choice you can have within it. Obviously, you have some choice about how much this stipend should be. I think it's advisable to not try and give an exact dollar figure of like, we will give this many $100 a week or something like that, because I think that if you do that, you run into the danger that every number under close enough interrogation has problems with it. And it's better to have the debate be about the concept of the stipend than whether you've specifically picked the right number or not. So it might be useful to give some kind of vague indication of, let's say, for example, we're going to approximate how much monetary value the NDIS provides people that access it. And instead of giving it to them through the NDIS, we will give it to them directly in cash. You see how that describes that you're going to be giving about the same value of money as the negative team, but without you needing to say exactly what that number is, which would just be a massive distraction for the debate. You also do have a bit of modeling about whether you want everyone to get the same amount of money. Remember that this is like a sensitive kind of thing though. So you don't want to use words such as like some disabilities are like more or less important, but you could, for example, frame it in terms of what specifically a service would need to provide, and do different people with different sort of severities of disabilities get more or less out of a service, and that means that they should get more or less out of a stipend. You can describe it in those terms, but remember to be quite sensitive with it. Especially because, and this is like a really big thing for the debate, lots of disabilities are very invisible. Obviously, someone who has like an amputated leg or someone who is in a wheelchair, that is very visible. But lots of people have what are less visible disabilities. That might be that they're psychological or they're intellectual disabilities. It might be that they have physical disabilities, but they're things such as like chronic pain that are not visible. So remember that in your debate room, it is very, very possible that there are people that have the disabilities that you are talking about in the debate. And while you should always in debate sort of imagine that the group you are talking about is in the room with you, this is one where it is very possible, even if it is not visible. So you do want to make sure that you are quite sensitive with it. With the negative team, again, you need to support a government disability service. Do not try and argue for the middle ground, because then the affirmative team can also argue for the middle ground. And if teams do that, there is no point of difference in the debate. So what you can do, however, is you can look at what is the current service that is provided. Do we think that it is a good service? If you think that it is just better as it currently is than a direct stipend would be, you can just support that. if you agree with the affirmative team that there are some specific problems with the existing services, but that you think that they can be fixed without needing to resort to a direct stipend, then you can do that. You do not have to support the status quo, but you do still need to support some alternative, specifically form of disability service. You cannot get out of that part of the debate. So it is worth thinking about, is there something else that we should support? But it still needs to be a service. It cannot be just money given directly to people. The next thing to look at is brainstorming point ideas. Now, this is the part of the video where I sort of encourage you that there isn't a whole lot more in terms of the context that I give you from this point on. This is probably a good point to pause the video and brainstorm individually, or if you're watching this with your team, so that you can then go over and share your ideas together there, rather than sort of do it really rushed, because this is the part where if you access the sessions on Tuesdays, and obviously I'm incredibly sorry that this one did not happen on the Tuesday. This is the only form that this one is accessible in. But a lot of the time spent in these sessions is often the brainstorming, where we give you feedback on the ideas that you come up with, and I cannot do that through a YouTube video. So this is going to be obviously more abridged, and so I recommend pausing the video so that you can add some time into it that you want to in terms of brainstorming. But before you get into brainstorming, there are a few tips that I recommend you take. The first thing is, as an affirmative team, make sure that you are comparative to the broad concept of government services. Do not make your arguments too comparative to one specific model of government services in case the negative team does not support it. So if you keep on pointing out problems with the existing form of the NDIS and the negative team runs a counter model, all of your points are going to have a lot less value because they have sort of gone slightly sideways to the negative team. Try and make sure that your arguments are built around the problems that exist inevitably with any form of government service and the positives that exist with all forms of direct stipends, because that's the comparison in the debate. Likewise, I think that negative teams should make sure that they make it very, very clear if they have some kind of counter model when they're relating it to their points. And listen really carefully to the affirmative team. You do not want to have arguments that are about how a government scheme is able to account for different ways that disabilities affect people. If the affirmative team has modeled in that you are going to get different amounts of money based on some form of calculation that calculates how much need you have. So you want to make sure that you listen very carefully. The second thing I'd recommend that you do is you deliberately think about different stakeholders. Obviously, in a debate about people with disabilities, all of the stakeholders sort of are people with disabilities. In the same way that if you have a debate about women's rights, the impact on men is probably a fairly unpersuasive point. The impact on able-bodied people is probably not nearly as compelling in this debate as the impact on people with disabilities. But that doesn't mean you cannot still have multiple points. If you think about the ways that different types of people with disabilities are affected, it's probably the case that people with physical disabilities are affected quite differently by government schemes or a direct stipend than people with intellectual disabilities. Are there some types of people with disabilities that find it very difficult to access schemes in the first place? Is there some kind of burden of proof that sometimes it's very difficult to actually get a box ticked agreeing that you do have a disability in order to get support? Is that something that is easier to access on one side than the other? These are kinds of questions that you can ask that help you sort of work out that there are multiple different ways that similar groups are affected, and that can be the backbone for a number of different points, as well as talking in the more broad sense about even outside the context of necessarily just disability services. Are direct stipends better than government services for any sort of marginalized group at the same time? These are the sorts of things that might be useful when you're brainstorming arguments. Again, in the video, in the Zoom calls when we do these on Tuesdays, this is a point where we'd share ideas. We cannot do this through the video, but that doesn't mean it's not still worth sharing ideas with your teammates if you're here if you're watching this with your team, or sharing your ideas when you get back to your next training session if you're watching this by yourself. But a few tips in terms of structuring arguments. I think that what you want to do in this kind of debate is you really want to tell the story about how you solve a problem. So when you start with your point and that there is a problem in the debate, if you are the affirmative team and you say there is a problem with existing government services, why is this true? What do these problems look like? Explain them. And then also give evidence and examples of how you are going to solve that problem by using your solution. Don't jump from here's the problem, here is what it looks like when it is fixed. Make sure that you step through here's how our solution, our model is what is going to fix this problem. Similarly, on the negative team, make sure that you don't just poke holes in a government stipend. Make sure that you specifically explain how a government service is going to solve any problem that might exist in that world. And likewise, in responding to arguments, this is the kind of debate where it's very, very important to listen quite carefully to the models provided by the other team. They might have a model that is slightly different to what you expect. And that means that you need to make sure that you rebut what actually their model is and don't rebut their arguments on the idea of a model that you didn't anticipate. So try and persuade the adjudicator that the other team's arguments are wrong, even in the model that they have created, or why their arguments, even if they're true, are not as important as the impacts that you're able to bring. Again, in the videos, this is where we'd ask if people have any questions that they would like to ask. If you do have any questions about this debate, though, feel free to reach out to the QDU, particularly if it's just in terms of, we can't really tell you, oh, is this argument good? Is this argument bad? But if you have a question just about what words and topics mean, things like that, we are able to help. We have PowerPoints that can help you learn about different types of topics, things like this. And similarly, it's very possible we can answer this question without you even needing to reach out to us, because we have a lot of videos on the website that you've already found, the QDU Debating Union YouTube, colloquially known as the QD YouTube. We have lots of ideas about things such as points of information, which obviously we didn't cover in this session, but is a part of grade 12 debating, and it might be useful for you to have a look at them if you are unfamiliar or you need to catch up on them. We have videos on this resource that you can access to learn more about things like that. Thank you all for listening and or watching this video. We hope that you've learned something from it and you're well prepared for your next debate, and best of luck for that next debate.